Welcome to Soft Sleep Tales, a place where timeless stories, gentle narration, and quiet atmospheres guide you toward rest. Before tonight's story begins, you are warmly invited to share where you are listening from in the comments below. It is always a comfort to see this quiet community reaching across the world night by night. And if these stories bring you a sense of calm, you are welcome to subscribe and join us on these peaceful journeys. Now, take a moment to get comfortable. Settle into your bed or your favorite chair. Gently close your eyes, take a slow, deep breath, and allow the day to soften and fade. Let my voice carry you quietly into sleep, to a place where imagination drifts and rest comes naturally. The letter from the solicitor had arrived on a Tuesday. Clara Asher had read it standing in the narrow hallway of her Islington lodgings, still wearing her coat, her school bag not yet set down. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully, placed it in the inside pocket of her coat, closest to her chest, and had not taken it out again until she was on the train. Her grandmother had died on the 4th of July. Peacefully, the solicitor's letter said, in her own bed at Chalcombe farm, in the early hours of a Thursday morning. The woman who found her was Mrs. Brooch from the village, who came Wednesdays and Saturdays. She had not suffered. She had simply stopped. Clara had gone to the funeral, of course. Her mother and her aunt had been there. Various cousins she saw only at occasions such as this. And the whole village of Eddington had turned out in the particular way that small English villages turned out for the death of a woman who had lived among them for 60 years. There had been a great deal of tea afterward, cold ham, people telling Clara things about her grandmother that she had already known. She had not gone to the farm after the funeral. She was not sure why. Her mother had gone briefly with the solicitor to collect certain papers. Clara had returned to London on the evening train, had spent the following weeks in the particular suspended quality of grief that did not yet feel quite real, continuing her work, her lessons, her ordinary days, while carrying somewhere beneath all of it the knowledge that something had permanently changed. The farm had been left to her. This was not entirely a surprise. She had been the closest to Ruth Asher of all her grandmother's grandchildren, the one who came every summer, who stayed the longest, who had learned where the spare key lived and how the range needed to be coaxed on cold mornings. But the reality of it had not properly settled. That Chalcombe farm was now hers to decide about, that the decision was real and immediate and hers alone. She had come now because the solicitor had said she should, and because she had understood, somewhere beneath the practical reasons, that she needed to. The train from London reached Devizes in the early afternoon of the 19th of August. The platform was quiet. A handful of passengers, the station master moving without urgency across the far end of the platform, the August heat pressing down across the pale stone of the station building with the particular weight of a season at its fullest point. She had arranged for a trap from the village. The driver was a young man she did not recognize. The usual driver, old Mr. Fenn, having apparently retired over the winter. He loaded her bag without ceremony and set off along roads Clara had last travelled in June of the previous year, the summer before this one, when everything had still been ordinary. The Wiltshire countryside unrolled around her, pale chalk downland rising on the left, the particular bare-backed quality of the high ground, and below it the lower fields in the amber gold of a harvest already largely gathered. the straw left standing in loose arrangements across the stubble, the whole landscape carrying the particular exhausted abundance of August's end. She had forgotten how much she loved this countryside, or perhaps not forgotten, simply set aside, in London, the particular quality of this specific light on this specific chalk and flint and summer-dried grass. The memory of it arrived now with a sharpness that surprised her. The recognition of a landscape that had been part of her understanding of the world since childhood, arriving back into her chest with something closer to pain than she had anticipated. She had come here every summer of her life until she was 22. Then, less regularly. The pressures of work, the difficulty of arranging time, the gradual accumulation of adult obligations that made childhood's easy freedoms feel like something belonging to a different person. But she had always come, even when the visits had grown shorter, even when a week had shrunk to 3 days. She had always come. Last summer had been a full week. She was glad of that now. The trap turned down the lane toward Chalcombe at 2:30. She knew the turning before the driver indicated it, knew the particular angle of the hedgerow, the way the lane narrowed abruptly between high banks of elder and hawthorn, the slight dip in the ground that always collected standing water after rain, even in the driest summers, the familiar geography of the approach settling around her, recognition mixed with grief, comfort mixed with the particular ache of returning to a place that held someone who was no longer there. The farmhouse appeared at the lane's end, old Wiltshire stone, the pale grey gold of the local limestone, the farmhouse low and long, with its particular uneven roofline, the kitchen garden visible at the far side, the apple trees in the small orchard beyond the gate already beginning to show the early flush of fruit not yet ripe. Everything exactly as it had always been. The stone mounting block beside the gate, the iron latch on the garden gate, worn smooth at the thumb position from decades of the same hand lifting it, the lavender border along the path to the front door, overgrown slightly now from its last cutting, the stems woody and sprawling in the August heat. Clara sat in the trap for a moment after the driver stopped. She was not ready. And then she was, because readiness was not, she understood, something that arrived on its own. It was simply what happened when you got out of the trap anyway. She got out. She paid the driver, thanked him, watched the trap turn back up the lane, and then she was alone in front of the farmhouse with her bag at her feet and the key in her hand, and the particular silence of a house that had been empty for 6 weeks pressing against the August afternoon around her. The solicitor had arranged for Mrs. Birch to air the rooms the previous week. The house did not smell of absence the way Clara had feared. Instead, it smelled of old stone and the particular accumulated scent of a long-inhabited kitchen, and faintly, very faintly, of the dried lavender her grandmother had hung in bundles from the beams above the range every summer as far back as Clara could remember. She set her bag in the narrow hallway, stood for a moment. Simply, the kitchen was to the left. The heart of the house always had been, the room where her grandmother spent most of her waking hours in the particular industrious calm of someone who had never learned to be idle and had stopped trying. Clara moved toward it without deciding to, pulled by habit and memory equally, and stood in the kitchen doorway looking at the range, the long wooden table, the dresser with its accumulated plates and jugs, and the small collection of objects her grandmother had kept on the top shelf: a china dog, two brass candlesticks, a photograph in a plain wooden frame. She went to the photograph. Her grandmother, perhaps 40 years old, standing in front of the farmhouse with a man Clara recognized as her grandfather Thomas, dead long before Clara's birth. A summer photograph. The light, the particular quality of a July afternoon, the same light that now came through the kitchen window, the same light it had always been. She looked at her grandmother's face in the photograph for a long time. Then she made tea, because it was what her grandmother would have done, and what needed doing, and because the practical act of filling the kettle and setting it on the range gave her hands something to do while the rest of her adjusted slowly to being here. She had drunk half the tea and was beginning to think about unpacking when she heard the gate. The particular iron sound of the latch lifting. She had heard it 10,000 times. Footsteps on the path then, unhurried, and then a knock at the kitchen door. She opened it. A man of perhaps 70 stood on the step, upright and weathered in the manner of someone who had worked the same land for 50 years and been shaped by it accordingly. His face was deeply lined, his hands large and capable, his expression carrying the particular combination of directness and careful tact that people who knew how to deliver difficult things developed over a long working life. In his left hand he held a small bunch of garden flowers, marigold and yarrow, the kind that grew in cottage gardens rather than florists' shops. He said his name was Silas Pound. He said he had farmed the land adjacent to Chalcombe for most of his life, that he had known Ruth Asher across the whole of that time, that he was sorry for her loss. He offered the flowers with the directness of a man who had decided to bring them and was not going to make a fuss about it either way. Clara thanked him and took the flowers and invited him in, because it was what her grandmother would have done, and because she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she was glad to see another person. She made more tea. They sat at the long kitchen table, Silas Pound, with the particular stillness of a man entirely comfortable in silence. Clara with the flowers in a jug of water between them. He asked whether she had come to stay. She said she had come for a few days, at least. He nodded at this without elaborating his thoughts on the matter. He asked whether anyone had been out to see to the bees. She looked at him. She said she was not sure. She did not think so. Not since her grandmother. Silas Pound set his tea down. He said, carefully, that there was something she ought to know about the bees. Something her grandmother would have wanted done. Something he had been uncertain about doing in her absence. That he had felt it was hers to do when she came, but that it was past time now, and should not wait any further. Clara asked what he meant. He was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of someone choosing how to explain a thing that might seem, to an outsider, unusual. He said, "The bees need to be told." She had never heard the expression. She said so, and Silas Pound nodded, not surprised, simply acknowledging that this was the kind of knowledge that had been passing out of common use for a generation or two already, and that he had expected she might not know it. He explained it simply. When someone in a beekeeping family died, the bees had to be told. You went to each hive, you knocked gently on the wood, and you spoke the news, quietly, directly, the way you would tell anyone. Some people tied a piece of dark cloth to the hive as well, a mark of mourning. If you did not tell them, the old belief held, the bees would leave, or they would not winter well, or something of the colony's particular vitality would simply diminish without the acknowledgement. He said he did not know whether he believed this literally or not. He said he had never tested the question by failing to do it, and he was not inclined to start now. He said Ruth Asher had told the bees every death in this family going back as far as she could remember her own grandmother telling her, that it was the way things were done at Chalcombe, had always been, and he suspected she would have wished it continued, regardless of who found the idea unusual. Clara thought about this. She thought about her grandmother standing at the hive rows in the early morning, the way she always had, moving among the kits with the particular unhurried confidence of someone the bees had long since decided to tolerate. She had watched her grandmother do this since childhood without ever fully understanding what she was doing, only that it was something that required a particular quality of calm attention, and that it was not to be interrupted. She said she would go before dark. Silas Pound nodded. He said that was right. He drank the last of his tea and rose and said he would not stay longer, that she needed the house to herself, that she should come and find him if anything needed attending to while she was here. He said one further thing before he left. He said that Ruth had had 6 hives, and that the 6th was the oldest, had been there longer than any of the others by a considerable span of years, and that it was the one her grandmother had paid particular attention to. He said this without further elaboration, in the tone of someone passing along information and leaving its significance for another person to discover. Then he took his leave. Clara stood in the kitchen doorway watching him go back down the path and through the gate with the same unhurried pace with which he had arrived, the iron latch settling behind him with its familiar sound. She unpacked her bag in the room she had always used, her grandmother's spare room at the back of the house, looking out over the kitchen garden, and beyond it the lower field and the line of willows at the field's far edge that marked the course of the small stream running through the farm's boundary. The room was exactly as it had always been. The white-painted iron bedstead, the patchwork quilt in the particular faded blues and greens her grandmother had made from old dress fabric some time before Clara's birth, the small chest of drawers with the oval mirror above it, the single hook on the back of the door. She sat on the edge of the bed for a moment. The August afternoon pressed quietly against the window, the heat of the day beginning its slow decline now, the light shifting from its midday white toward the amber of late afternoon. Through the glass she could see the kitchen garden, still ordered and tended despite 6 weeks' absence. Mrs. Birch, presumably, or Silas Pound, or simply the particular tenacity of things that had been properly established and needed little intervention to continue. And beyond the garden, at the far left edge of her view from this window, the corner of the hive rows was just visible. 6 low shapes on their wooden stands at the field's edge, beneath the old hawthorn hedge that had sheltered them from the north wind as long as Clara could remember, dark in the late afternoon light, quiet seeming from this distance, though she knew that what appeared quiet from here was in fact alive with the particular dense, organized activity that had always seemed to her, watching her grandmother, something close to miraculous in its complexity and scale. She sat looking at them for a while. Then she went downstairs and put on her grandmother's old coat, hanging still on its hook by the back door where it had always hung, and went out into the August afternoon. The path to the hives ran along the edge of the kitchen garden, between the last row of beans and the low stone wall that separated the garden proper from the field beyond. She had walked this path many times, always behind her grandmother, always at the slight, careful distance that her grandmother had taught her was correct, close enough to observe, far enough not to alarm. She had never walked it alone. The knowledge of this arrived with particular sharpness as she passed through the garden gate and turned toward the field. The afternoon was warm and still, the particular stillness of August at its fullest point, not the busy stillness of spring, not the anticipatory stillness of early summer, but something heavier, more complete, the stillness of a season that has achieved everything it set out to achieve and is now simply being, without urgency, in what it has made. She could hear the bees before she reached the hives. The sound came first as a quality in the air rather than a specific noise, a low, dense vibration beneath the ordinary sounds of the afternoon. The distant wood pigeons, the slight movement of the hawthorn leaves in the barely there breeze. And then, as she came closer, resolving itself into the particular layered hum she had always associated with this corner of the farm, not a single sound but a collective one, many thousands of individual contributions forming something that felt, in its overall quality, like a kind of very serious contentment. She stopped a few feet from the nearest hive, 6 hives in a row along the hedge, facing south as her grandmother had always said they should. The first 5 of a similar age and size, wooden boxes painted in the pale grey-green her grandmother had always used, the paint weathered and chipped in places to show the layers beneath. The 6th was different, larger than the others, and older, the wood darker with age, the grain raised by decades of weather, the paint entirely gone from the top and sides, replaced by the particular silver grey that old wood became when it had been long enough in the open air. It sat at the end of the row, like something that had been there before the row existed, which, she understood from Silas Pound's comment, was perhaps precisely the case. She stood before the first hive. She felt, standing there alone in the August afternoon, considerably more uncertain than she had expected to feel. Not about the bees. She had been around them enough to understand that calm and stillness were what the situation required, and she was, by nature and by practice, a calm and still person. But about the words, about how one actually did this. She thought about what Silas Pound had said. You knock gently, and you told them. She raised her hand and knocked softly on the hive's side. 3 small taps, the wood warm from the afternoon sun beneath her knuckles. She said, quietly, "My grandmother has died. Ruth Asher, who kept you. She died on the 4th of July, in her own bed, and she did not suffer. I am her granddaughter. I have come to tell you." The hum continued, undisturbed. A few bees moved across the landing board at the hive's base, their flight paths the usual purposeful arcs of a colony going about its ordinary work. Nothing changed. Nothing acknowledged her. And yet she found, having spoken the words aloud, that something had shifted very slightly in the quality of the afternoon around her. The plain, simple words, said directly to something that could not understand them in any rational accounting, and yet said, and the saying of them mattering in some way she had not anticipated before she had done it. She moved to the second hive. She made her way along the row in the same manner, the knock, the words, the moment of stillness, 5 times before she reached the 6th. By the 3rd hive, she had stopped feeling self-conscious about it. By the 4th, she had stopped thinking about how she must look. A 27-year-old schoolteacher from London standing in a Wiltshire field speaking to beehives. By the 5th, she had begun to understand something of why her grandmother had done this. Not as superstition, exactly, but as a form of acknowledgement. The particular discipline of pausing long enough to say a thing out loud that might otherwise be carried silently and indefinitely. The 6th hive stood before her. She stopped in front of it. It was larger than the others by a considerable margin. Deep boxes stacked 4 high, the whole structure reaching almost to her shoulder where the others reached her waist. The sound from within was different too. Lower in register, denser, the particular sound of a very large and very established colony. The wood, up close, showed not just age, but a particular quality of attention. Repairs made at various points across the decades. Pieces of new timber spliced carefully into old. The whole structure held together with a care that suggested someone had never been willing to simply replace it. She raised her hand to knock, and then she paused, her knuckles not quite touching the wood, because something in the hive's aspect had caught her attention that she had not registered from a few feet further away. Along the bottom of the lowest box, where the entrance board met the wood above it, the gap was slightly larger than it should have been, the wood having shrunk or shifted with age, creating a narrow, irregular space between the bottom board and the hive body. And in this gap, worked deep into the join and sealed over with the particular dark resin the bees used for everything requiring a substance harder than wax, something that was not wood and not propolis and not anything belonging to a beehive was just barely visible. She crouched, looked more closely, the afternoon light at this low angle catching something metallic, small, dark with age and propolis coating, but unmistakably catching light in a way that wood did not. She sat back on her heels in the dry August grass, looked at it for a long time without touching it, the bees moving in their ordinary patterns around her, indifferent to her presence, entirely absorbed in the final gathering work of the day's last good hours. She thought about Silas Pound's careful phrasing. The 6th is the oldest, the one your grandmother paid particular attention to. She stood. She completed the telling, the knock, the words, the brief stillness, and then she straightened and looked at the 6th hive one last time before turning back toward the house along the familiar path. The sun was beginning its lower decline, the August afternoon easing toward evening at the field's far edge, the willows along the stream catching the last direct light in their particular silver-green way. She thought, walking back, about what she had seen lodged in the join of the oldest hive. She thought about her grandmother's hands, moving with their usual unhurried competence along this same path, checking the same hives, tending the same bees, season after season for 60 years. She thought that she would need to look more carefully in the morning, that whatever was held in that old wood, in the careful resin of the bee's own keeping, had been there long enough that one more evening of waiting would not diminish whatever it had to tell. She went inside as the first swallows of the evening began their circuits above the farm, and made herself a simple supper at her grandmother's kitchen table, the familiar room settling around her with its accumulated warmth in the cooling August evening, the lavender smell still present in the beams above, the old coat hanging by the back door, the photograph on the dresser shelf. She sat for a long time after she had eaten, simply sitting, the way her grandmother had always sat at the end of a day, not idle, not inactive, but present entirely in the quiet of a place she knew and trusted and had tended for a very long time. Clara was not yet sure whether Chalcombe was hers in that way, but she thought, sitting in the kitchen as the August evening moved slowly toward dark, that she might be beginning to understand what it would take to find out. She went to bed early. In the iron-framed bed with the patchwork quilt, the back window opened to the night sounds of the farm, the distant stream, the last birds, the faint, steady hum that she realized, lying in the dark, she could still hear from the direction of the hive row, or perhaps was imagining, perhaps both. She fell asleep slowly, the August night warm around her, the old house settling into its familiar sounds, the bees keeping their patient vigil at the field's edge exactly as they had through every night of the 60 years her grandmother had tended them. And in the gap of the oldest hive, in the dark, the thing the bees had been keeping stayed exactly where it had always been, patient, waiting, as bees, and kept things, and the particular quiet of old farms in August had always known how to wait. She woke before 6, the August morning arriving with the particular quality of high summer mornings in the English countryside, the light already present, already warm, the birds already well into whatever they had been saying to each other since before she woke. She lay in the iron-framed bed for a few minutes simply listening. The wood pigeon in the orchard, something smaller in the kitchen garden hedge, and beneath both of them, very faint, the sound she had gone to sleep with. The bees, already at work, the hum of them reaching her even through the closed window, even at this distance, the colony's morning activity already underway in the field beyond the garden. She got up, dressed in the practical things she had brought for the purpose, the heavy cotton skirt, the long-sleeved blouse, the boots she had purchased in London, with the particular uncertainty of someone preparing for conditions they had not yet encountered. She went downstairs, put the kettle on the range, stood at the south-facing kitchen window while it heated and looked at the morning, the kitchen garden in the early light, the bean rows casting long shadows eastward, the apple trees in the small orchard beyond just beginning to catch the sun on their upper branches, and further, past the low stone wall, the corner of the hive row just visible beneath the hawthorn hedge, the 6 shapes on their stands, already busy, already entirely absorbed in the serious work of a summer morning. She made her tea and drank it at the kitchen table, looking at nothing in particular, thinking about nothing in particular, or rather thinking about the thing she had found the previous evening without quite thinking about it directly, the way the mind returned to an unresolved matter in the particular oblique manner of early mornings before the day's more deliberate thinking had properly begun. The thing in the join of the 6th hive, the metallic catching of light, small, dark with propolis, worked deep into the gap between the bottom board and the hive body, sealed over as though the bees themselves had made a decision about it. She drank the last of her tea and set the cup down. She thought, I am going to need to understand what I am doing before I try to retrieve it. The hive is alive. The colony is large. Whatever is in that gap has been in that gap for long enough that the bees have sealed it in, and unsealing it is going to require either the colony's cooperation or its temporary distraction. She did not know how to manage either of these things. She thought of Silas Pound, his comment about the sixth hive offered without elaboration, the particular reticence of someone who knew more than they said and had said what seemed appropriate for a first conversation. She thought he might know more, and that visiting him was probably the right next step before she attempted anything at the hive itself. But first she wanted to go and look again, in the daylight, more carefully, to confirm that what she had seen the previous evening in the declining afternoon light was what she thought she had seen. She put on her grandmother's coat and went out through the kitchen door. The morning was cooler than the afternoon had been. Not cold August in Wiltshire was not cold, even in its mornings, but the particular freshness of a summer morning before the sun had been up long enough to warm the ground properly. The grass in the kitchen garden still holding its overnight dew, the cobwebs across the bean rows visible as silver threads in the low angled light, the smell of the morning damp earth and garden, and from the hedge, something floral she could not immediately identify. She went through the garden gate and across the field toward the hive row, walking more slowly than she had the previous evening. The field slightly wet underfoot from the dew, the dry August grass of the previous afternoon transformed by the night into something cooler and more giving. The shadows of the hedge long across the field toward her, the hawthorn still in the shade of its own eastern wall. The bees were active, more active than she had expected. The morning's low light made them visible as movement, small dark shapes against the paleness of the field beyond, coming and going from the hive entrances in a constant stream that was purposeful and dense and entirely organized. She stopped a few feet away and simply watched this for a moment. The particular quality of that movement, not random, not chaotic, each bee departing on a flight path that curved away from the hive with the precision of something that knew exactly where it was going and had been going there long enough to have found the most efficient route, and each returning bee descending on an approach that was equally precise, equally deliberate. She had always found bees, as a child, slightly alarming. The noise of them, the unpredictability of the individual bee, the sense that any one of them might make a decision about you that you would find unpleasant. But her grandmother had been perfectly calm among them always, and Clara had learned from that calm the way children learned from the unspoken emotional information their trusted adults provided. Standing here now, alone, without her grandmother's calm to borrow, she was surprised to find that she was not alarmed, that the noise of the hive in the morning, the organized, busy sound of it, produced in her something closer to the response she had when she entered a well-run classroom, a room with its own established rhythms and purposes, a room that knew what it was for and was getting on with it. She moved carefully toward the sixth hive, keeping her movements slow and deliberate, not stopping to think about whether this was the right approach, simply doing what felt considered, what felt respectful of the colony's seriousness of purpose. She crouched before it, the morning light coming from the east at a low angle, better for what she needed, the direct morning sun reaching the bottom of the hive and illuminating the gap between the bottom board and the hive body more clearly than the declining afternoon light had managed. She looked. It was there, exactly as she had thought. a small object lodged in the gap, worked in and sealed over with propolis, the dark, waxy resin the bees used for filling and sealing everything that required it. The propolis coating the object almost entirely, the seal built up over what she judged to be considerable time years, certainly, possibly, many years. But through the propolis, the shape of the thing beneath was still faintly visible, an oval, small the size of a thumbnail, perhaps slightly larger, and at one edge, just visible, where the propolis had not entirely covered everything, a glint of silver, the unmistakable catching of morning light on metal. She sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long time, the bees moving around her, in and out. She was close enough to the hive entrance that the bees were rooting around her, not avoiding her with alarm, simply incorporating her presence into their flight calculations the way they incorporated any obstacle in their path. She thought about how long it had been there. The propolis coating was substantial, not freshly applied, something that had accumulated over many seasons, layer upon layer of the bee's own careful work. She thought, that object was placed there deliberately, not accidentally lodged, not something that had fallen into the gap and been sealed in by the bee's ordinary housekeeping, something placed into the gap of the hive with intention and then left there and then sealed in by the bees, who simply found a space that needed filling and filled it. She stood. She needed to speak to Silas Pound, and before she spoke to Silas Pound, she needed to look through whatever her grandmother had left behind in the house. She turned and walked back toward the farmhouse. The house in the morning had a different quality from the house in the afternoon. The afternoon light had given everything warmth. The morning light came from the east, cooler and more precise, the kind of light that showed things clearly rather than warmly. She started in the kitchen, because her grandmother had lived most of her life in the kitchen, and because if there was anything to be found that might illuminate the sixth hive's history, she thought it was more likely to be in the accumulated practical objects of the kitchen than in the more formal space of the sitting room. The dresser first. 3 shelves. She went through the lower shelf carefully. A tin box of buttons, a small handled magnifying glass, a folded piece of dark ribbon, approximately 18 inches long, a candle stub, a key she did not recognize, smaller than a door key, larger than a padlock key, the kind of key that opened a box or a cabinet. She set the key on the kitchen table and continued. In the back of the third drawer, beneath a folded tea cloth, a small notebook, different from the account books in the study. Smaller, the cover a faded blue, the pages soft with use. She sat down at the kitchen table and opened it. Her grandmother's handwriting. She recognized it immediately, the particular compact and slightly angular script that had addressed birthday cards to Clara every year of her life. The notebook was about the bees. Not formally, not a record book. Something more personal. Notes in the margins, observations written in no particular order, the accumulated thoughts of a person who had been thinking about the same subject for a very long time. She turned the pages slowly. Practical notes about the colonies, which had swarmed and when, what the winter losses had been across various years. But threaded through these practical notes, at irregular intervals, something else. References to the sixth hive that were different in character from the references to the others. She read slowly. Hive 6 strong again this spring, as it always is. There is something settled about that colony that the others don't have. 40 years of beekeeping, and I still can't entirely account for it. She turned more pages. The sixth hive has been at Chalcombe longer than I have. I've never changed the brood box. Whatever is in the bottom of it has been in the bottom of it since before I arrived. I think about this sometimes. Clara sat very still. Read the entry again. Whatever is in the bottom of it has been in the bottom of it since before I arrived. Her grandmother had known that something was in the hive, had chosen, across 40 years, never to disturb it. The sixth hive had been at Chalcombe before her grandmother came, before 1849, before Ruth Asher had arrived as a young woman to begin the life she would spend here. She turned more pages, looking now with more specific attention for any further mention of the sixth hive's history, of what had been at Chalcombe before her grandmother. She found it near the middle of the notebook, a longer entry, the writing slightly more careful. Old Mrs. Clement told me when I first came that the sixth hive had been here since her mother's time, which would put it at the farm by the 1820s at the latest. Her mother's name was Margaret. Mrs. Clement said her mother had kept that hive separate from the others always, had never harvested from it, and that she had told her daughter before she died that it was a remembrance hive and to leave it be. Mrs. Clement honoured this, and so have I, though neither of us ever knew what it was remembering. Clara closed the notebook carefully, placed it on the kitchen table, sat with her hands flat on either side of it, and looked at the kitchen wall and thought. A remembrance hive. The same instinct her grandmother had honoured across 40 years, passing it forward from the woman who had kept the hive before her, who had received it in turn from her own mother, who had established it sometime in the 1820s and had called it before Clara's grandmother was born, before Mrs. Clement was born, a remembrance hive. And in the base of it, sealed in with decades of propolis, something small and oval and silver. Something placed there with the same deliberate intention with which the hive itself had been set apart. She looked at the key on the kitchen table, the small key she had found in the back of the dresser's lower shelf. Too small for a door, the kind of key that opened a box. She thought, there is a box somewhere that this key fits, and that whatever is in the box may tell her more than the notebook has. She picked the key up and put it in her pocket. She walked to Silas Pound's farm mid-morning. The lane from Chalcombe to the adjacent farm ran along the field boundary for perhaps half a mile, then a left turn onto a narrower track between two fields before reaching the farmyard. She had been shown this route as a child, had walked it perhaps twice in the summers at Chalcombe. Silas Pound was in the yard when she arrived. He looked up when she entered with the unhurried acknowledgement of a man who had been expecting her at some point that morning and was not surprised she had come. She told him what she had found. The thing in the base of the sixth hive, the notebook in the kitchen dresser, the entry about Mrs. Clement, and the phrase remembrance hive. The small key. He listened without interrupting. When she had finished, he set down what he was holding and looked at her with the expression of a man deciding how much of what he knows is his to tell. He said, I know something about the Clement family. He said the Clements were at Chalcombe before her grandmother and before the daughter who sold the farm, farming that land from before his father's time. The old woman her grandmother met when she first came, Mrs. Clement, was the last of the family on the farm. She went to live with her daughter in Bath after she sold, and died there. Clara asked about the hive. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he had been told something once, years ago, by his own father, who had known the Clements, that the hive had been at Chalcombe since the earliest part of the century, that it had been brought there by a woman who came to the farm as a bride in the very early years of the 1800s, that the family who kept the hive after her had always called it the Remembrance Hive and had never taken honey from it, that his father had not known why, only that it was so. Clara asked about the woman who had brought the hive. He said he did not know her name, had never been told it, had not thought to ask when his father had told him, being young and not yet understanding that names were the part of stories that time took first. He said one further thing. He said that if Clara was going to retrieve whatever was in the base of the sixth hive, she would need to smoke the colony first, and that he had her grandmother's smoker in his barn had taken it for safekeeping when the farm went empty in February, had been keeping it until whoever came to the farm needed it. He said, "I can show you how to use it, if you'd like," and that the late afternoon would be the better time, the colony calmer in the heat of the day than in the active morning, the bees less likely to object to the disturbance when the sun was high and the field was warm and the foragers were all out working. She said that was right, that she would be ready. She walked back along the track to Chalcombe, the late morning warm around her, the Wiltshire countryside in its August fullness on every side, the particular quality of a morning that had already contained more than she had expected and was not yet finished with her. She spent the middle hours of the day in the house, not searching exactly, but attending to the house in a way she had not yet had time to attend to it, learning it in the daylight. In all the rooms, the sitting room, the books on the shelves, her grandmother's reading over 60 years, beekeeping books, annotated, county histories, novels, well read, the spines cracked, and one shelf she had not noticed, a row of small volumes, uniform in size, the covers dark cloth. She pulled one out, a diary, her grandmother's, the year written on the spine. She looked at the others, all diaries, 37 volumes, 37 years of her grandmother's daily life at Chalcombe, recorded in the same compact angular script as the bee notebook. She took the most recent from the shelf. This year's the year of her grandmother's death, the entries stopping in late June, 3 weeks before the July death. The last entry brief and practical. Weather very warm, bees working well, the late roses coming on. Her grandmother's last written words, entirely ordinary, the words of someone who had not known they would be last. She set the diary down. She was not ready to read these yet. Some things required a quality of readiness she had not yet arrived at. She would come back to the diaries. She would read them, but not today. She replaced the diary on the shelf and went upstairs. The box was in the bedroom. She had not intended to go to her grandmother's bedroom, had decided the previous evening she was not yet ready for that room, but the key was in her pocket, and the afternoon was approaching, and she was beginning to want to know. It was a quiet room, the north-facing window giving it a cool, even light, the bed made, the chest of drawers in its corner, the small mirror showing her own reflection arriving in the doorway. A room entirely itself, a room that had been one person's room for 60 years and still was. She did not look at the bed. She went to the chest of drawers, opened the top drawer carefully. Her grandmother's things, the handkerchiefs, the gloves, the modest accumulated accessories of a woman who did not accumulate accessories. And at the back of the drawer, beneath a folded length of lace, a box. Small, dark wood, simple construction, a plain brass plate on the front with a keyhole, the wood worn with handling at the corners, the size that would sit comfortably in two hands held together. She took the key from her pocket, fitted it to the keyhole. It turned, smoothly, without resistance, the tumblers moving with the ease of a mechanism that had been turned many times and was entirely familiar with the action. She lifted the lid. Inside the box, on a lining of faded blue silk, a folded paper, very old, the folds worn soft with repeated opening. A small card, handwritten in a script she did not recognize, older than her grandmother's hand. The letters formed differently. And beneath these, nestled in the silk, nothing. An absence where something had been. The faint impression in the old silk of a small oval shape, the shape of something that had rested in that spot for long enough to leave its ghost in the fabric and was no longer there. She picked up the folded paper first, unfolded it with the same care she had used for everything this morning. The paper fragile at the folds, the ink faded to a pale brown. She carried it to the window where the north light was strongest. It was a letter, a single page, not long, the writing the same unfamiliar hand as the card, careful, somewhat formal, the letter formation of someone who had learned to write with attention. It was not addressed to anyone by name. It began simply, "To whoever keeps the hive after me." She stood at the north window of her grandmother's bedroom in the August noon heat and read the letter that had been written to her and to her grandmother before her and to Mrs. Clement before that, by a woman who had placed a small thing in the base of the 6th hive at Chalcombe farm sometime in the early years of the 19th century and had wanted to explain why. She did not read it twice. She read it once, carefully, to the end. Then she folded it as it had been folded and replaced it in the box exactly as she had found it. She picked up the small card and looked at it, a name written in the same hand and a date. The date was 1812. The name was a woman's name she had not heard before. She closed the box, locked it, replaced it in the back of the chest of drawers beneath the folded lace, exactly as she had found it. She left her grandmother's bedroom and went back downstairs to the kitchen, put the kettle on, stood at the south window and looked at the hive row in the early afternoon light, the 6 shapes beneath the hawthorn, the 6th largest, the bees still working the midday foragers visible even at this distance. She stood there for a considerable time, turning over what she had read. The letter had been short, simple, the words of someone who had understood that she was writing across time and had accordingly used only the words she was certain would survive it. The kettle began to speak on the range. She made her tea, sat at the kitchen table, looked at the small key on the table's surface where she had set it down once more. She thought about the impression in the old silk of the box's lining, the ghost of something oval, small, that had rested in that spot and was no longer there. That was in the base of the 6th hive instead, sealed in with propolis, placed there at some point she now thought she knew when, and by whose hands, and left there under the care of the colony, passed from keeper to keeper across the generations, the hive tended and the thing within it undisturbed. She sat with her tea and waited for the afternoon, waited for the warmth of it to settle over the field, for the bees to ease into their high summer midday calm, for Silas Pound to arrive with the smoker, the August afternoon deepening around the farmhouse. the sound of the bees audible even through the kitchen walls, even at this distance, even in the heat of the midday. The hum of them patient and steady, and entirely unaware that the woman sitting at the kitchen table intended, before the day was out, to gently ask them to move aside. Silas Pound arrived at 3:30. She heard the gate before she heard his knock, the familiar iron sound of the latch, then his footsteps on the path, unhurried as they had been the previous day. He came to the kitchen door with the smoker in one hand and a folded veil in the other, and he set these on the kitchen table and looked at her with the particular assessment of someone determining whether a person is ready for a thing before committing to the instruction. She must have appeared ready enough. He sat down and began to explain the smoker. It was a simple device in principle. A bellows attached to a small firebox, the firebox burning whatever fuel was to hand. He used dried grass and a handful of wood chip, showing her how to pack it and how to get it drawing properly. The smoke, when it came, was cool and pale. She had expected it to smell strongly of burning, but it did not. It smelled of dry summer grass and something faintly sweet beneath that, the smoke mild and not unpleasant. He told her how to use it at the hive. A few puffs at the entrance first, then wait. The bees needed a moment to respond, to move away from the entrance and down into the hive, to begin doing what bees did when they smelled smoke, which was to eat honey in preparation for what their instincts told them might be a fire requiring them to leave. A colony that had taken in honey was a calmer colony. A calmer colony was less likely to take issue with whatever you needed to do in the vicinity of its home. He said she would not need to open the hive fully. The thing she wanted was in the bottom board, the base of the hive, beneath the brood box. She would not need to lift any boxes, not need to disturb the frames. She would only need to ease the bottom board forward slightly. It was designed to slide and reach into the gap. The smoke at the entrance would be sufficient for that. She would not need to go inside the hive. He asked if she had gloves. She said she had the pair she had brought from London, thick canvas, the kind sold in gardening shops. He looked at these briefly and said they would do. He said her grandmother's veil was on the hook inside the small shed at the field's edge, and that she should use it, that the smoker made the bees calm, but calm was not the same as indifferent, and that the veil was simply sensible. He said one more thing before he left. He said to move slowly at the hive, to not hesitate once she had started. The bees responded to uncertainty the way most creatures responded to it, which was with their own version of alarm. To do what she meant to do, steadily and without rushing, and the colony would accommodate her. He said her grandmother had always moved at the hives as though she had all the time in the world, and that the bees had always seemed to understand this as a quality that could be trusted. He picked up his hat and went to the door. Then he paused, turned back. He said, "Your grandmother never told me what was in the 6th hive." He said it with the particular directness of someone putting a thing on the table that needed to be on the table, not asking, simply stating the fact of his own ignorance and leaving it there between them. Clara looked at him. She said, "I'll tell you when I know the whole of it." He nodded, said that was fair, and went. She sat with the smoker on the kitchen table for a while after he had gone. The afternoon light through the south window, deep and golden now, the August sun well past its zenith. The particular quality of a late summer afternoon that had been warm all day and had acquired through the accumulation of hours a heaviness that was not unpleasant, the air thick with heat and the smell of the dry field grass. And, always, the low, continuous presence of the bees. She thought about the letter in the box upstairs. She had read it once, as she had told herself she would read it through to the end and then put it back. She had not read it a second time. She had wanted, before she read it again, to hold the thing in the hive in her hands, to have the physical reality of it alongside the written account. The letter described a brooch. She wanted to see the brooch before she read the description of it again, so that the reading of the description would be recognition rather than imagination. She put the smoker under her arm and went out through the kitchen door. The shed at the field's edge was small and practical. Tools along one wall, a workbench, the smell of oil and old wood. She found the veil on the hook exactly where Silas Pound had said it would be her grandmother's veil. The wire mesh dark with age but intact, the wide brim of it keeping the mesh away from the face. She put it on, put on her canvas gloves, picked up the smoker, and walked toward the hive row. The afternoon had settled into the particular quality Silas Pound had described. The heat of it heavy and still. The foragers out in their full numbers, the air above the hive row dense with the coming and going of them, the sound of the colony at the height of its summer work, filling the August afternoon. She stopped a few feet from the sixth hive and watched for a moment. Then she pumped the smoker's bellows twice and directed the pale smoke toward the hive entrance. She waited, 30 seconds, perhaps, long enough to feel uncertain about whether the smoke had done anything at all. And then, gradually, perceptibly, the activity at the entrance of the sixth hive changed. The bees still coming and going, the colony's work did not stop, but the character of the movement at the entrance shifting, becoming less dense, the bees moving inward rather than clustering. She moved forward. One more puff of smoke at the entrance as she crouched. Then she set the smoker down carefully on the dry grass beside her and turned her attention to the bottom board. It was exactly as Silas Pound had described. A wide flat board that formed the floor of the hive, designed to slide forward so that the beekeeper could clean and inspect it without disturbing the boxes above. She found the edges of it with her gloved fingers and eased it forward, slowly, the way she had been told, steadily, without hesitation. The board moved with the slight resistance of old wood that had not been moved recently, and then more freely, and then she had drawn it out perhaps 6 inches and stopped. She looked into the gap. The interior of the hive above her, the dark mass of the colony's lower structure, the propolis sealed join between the bottom board and the first brood box above it, the whole underside of the hive's working life visible now at close range. The smell of it, immediate and dense beeswax and propolis, and the particular warm sweetness of a working colony, a smell unlike anything else. And at the back of the exposed gap, against the inner edge of the frame where the bottom board met the hive side wall, there it was. In daylight, with the board drawn out, it was more visible than it had been through the exterior gap the previous evening. The propolis coating still thick over it, still dark with decades of accumulation, but the shape beneath clearer now, small, oval, the edge of it where the propolis was thinnest showing the unmistakable curve of worked metal. She reached in with her gloved hand, gently, working her fingers around the object rather than pulling directly, trying to understand how it was secured, whether it was simply resting in the propolis seal or embedded more deeply. It moved. Not easily, the propolis had a grip on it, but it moved, the seal yielding with a slight resistance that suggested years of grip rather than the absolute anchor she had half expected. She worked it carefully, rocking it slightly rather than pulling straight, feeling the propolis release its hold in small increments. The bees above her moving in their ordinary patterns, not disturbed, not alarmed, simply going on with the work that the smoke had redirected slightly but not stopped. And then the object came free. She held it in her gloved palm, small and dark with propolis, the oval shape of it clear now in the afternoon light, the metal warm from the hive's interior warmth. She eased the bottom board back carefully, gave the entrance one more puff of smoke as she straightened, picked up the smoker, stepped back from the hive, stood for a moment simply breathing, the object in her palm, the bees returning to their uninterrupted work around her as though nothing of any consequence had occurred. She walked back to the farmhouse. She set the brooch on the kitchen table. Not yet cleaned, she wanted to look at it as it was first, before she removed the propolis. In the afternoon light, through the south window, the object sat on the scrubbed wood of the table that had been her grandmother's and her grandmother's predecessors, and the predecessor before that, and she looked at it. An oval shape, small, the propolis coating dark and thick over most of the surface, but worn thin at the edges and at the highest point of the oval, where the metal beneath showed through in places. Silver, she had thought, and silver, it appeared to be the metal, visible at the thin places on the propolis, a pale grey that tarnished silver produced rather than the warmer tone of gold or brass. And at what she judged to be the centre of the oval, a darker area beneath the propolis, something set into the metal, a stone perhaps, though she could not yet see its colour or character through the coating. She went to the study and found what she needed in the small supply of practical things her grandmother had kept in the top desk drawer. A soft cloth, a small brush, the kind used for cleaning delicate things, and a jar of olive oil she had read somewhere, or been told by someone she could not now remember, that propolis responded to oil, that it was one of the things that dissolved it gently, without risk, to whatever lay beneath. She brought these to the kitchen table and sat down, the brooch in front of her, the afternoon quiet around the farmhouse, the bees audible still, distant and steady, the colony settling back into its ordinary rhythms now that the small disturbance of the afternoon had passed. She worked slowly, a little oil on the cloth, applied to the propolis with the lightest pressure, the propolis responding, softening in small areas where the oil penetrated, becoming workable rather than rigid. She used the brush for the detailed areas, the edges of the oval, the places where the propolis had worked into any engraving or setting. She did not hurry. She worked the way her grandmother had moved at the hives, as though she had all the time in the world, which in this particular August afternoon she did. The brooch emerged slowly from beneath its decades of coating. Silver, as she had thought, an oval silver brooch, the metal worked into a fine border of leaves and small flowers around the edge, not elaborate, not expensive looking, but careful, the work of a craftsman who had taken the commission seriously and had not cut corners in the execution. The silver tarnished dark from its years in the hive, but the detail of the border clear now that the propolis was gone, and at the centre of the oval, set into the silver, a stone, small, dark blue, she thought garnet at first, then looked more carefully. Not garnet, the colour deeper, tending toward the blue of a clear autumn sky rather than the red of wine. A sapphire, possibly, though she did not know enough about stones to be certain. Dark blue and intact, the setting around it undamaged despite the years of propolis and hive warmth it had been preserved in. She turned it over. The back of the brooch was plain silver, the pin and clasp mechanism intact, still functional, she thought, though she did not test it. And in the lower right corner of the back, very small, an engraving, 2 letters. She brought it close to the window to read them in the afternoon light. E.M. She set the brooch down on the cloth, looked at it for a moment. Then she went upstairs. She took the box from the chest of drawers and carried it to the bedroom window, unlocked it, lifted the folded paper from its lining of faded blue silk, carried it to the north light and opened it. She read it a second time, more slowly than the first reading, with the brooch now a physical reality downstairs rather than a described thing. The words of the letter arrived differently, each sentence landing, with a weight it had not had when she was reading it, into pure imagination. The letter was not long. It was the letter of someone who had understood that she was writing across an unknowable distance of time and had accordingly written only what she believed would matter, regardless of when it arrived. It said, "The brooch belonged to my mother. My mother was given it by her mother, who had it from her own mother, the beginning of it further back than I can trace. It came to me when my mother died, and I intended it to go to my daughter when I died in turn. But my daughter died before me in the spring of 1811, at 23 years of age, of a fever that took her within a week of its beginning." She paused. "Read that again. My daughter died before me." She continued, "I have no one to give it to now. I have thought about this for a year, and I have not been able to decide what to do with a thing that was meant to go forward and has nowhere to go. I do not want to bury it with her. She is already gone and does not need it where she is. I do not want to sell it or give it away to someone who does not know what it is. The bees have kept this farm with us since before my grandmother's time. They have outlasted everyone who has tended them. They will outlast me. I am putting the brooch in the oldest hive because the oldest hive is the most enduring thing I know, and because I want the brooch to be kept somewhere rather than lost, and because I cannot think of a better keeping than theirs. I do not know who will find this. I do not know if anyone will find it. The bees may keep it past all human reckoning, and it may simply remain where I have placed it for longer than anything else on this farm endures. But if you find it, I want you to know that it belonged to Eleanor Margaret Vane, who died in 1811, and that she was the last person meant to wear it, and that the initials on the back are hers. Keep it if you wish. Return it to the hive if you prefer. I leave that to whoever you are whose hands this has reached." The letter was signed with a name. Clara Pound read the name and understood then why the name on the small card had been unfamiliar. It was not the name of any family she knew or any family Silas had mentioned. It was the name of a woman who had lived at Chalcombe Farm in the earliest years of the 19th century and had put something into a beehive and walked away from it and had never been thought of again by anyone living, until now. She folded the letter and replaced it in the box, picked up the small card and looked at it again. The name and the date, 1812. The year after Eleanor Margaret Vane had died. The year her mother had placed the brooch in the 6th hive and written the letter and locked both in the box and put the key. She must have put the key somewhere it would be found, must have understood that someone would need to find it eventually, and had trusted the bees with the keeping. Clara set the card down beside the box. sat on the edge of her grandmother's bed. She had not meant to sit on the bed, had been careful not to, but she sat now without noticing that she had made the decision, and looked at the north window and the pale August sky beyond it. She thought about Eleanor Margaret Vane, 23 years old, dead of a fever in the spring of 1811. A woman she had never heard of before this morning, whose existence had been preserved in a beehive and a locked box and a letter addressed to no one on a farm in Wiltshire for the better part of 80 years. She thought about her grandmother, who had known something was in the sixth hive and had never disturbed it, had written in her notebook, "I think about this sometimes," had kept the hive, and kept the brooch's absence in the silk lining of the box, and kept the key in the back of the kitchen dresser drawer, and had passed all of it forward to Clara without knowing she was passing it forward to Clara specifically, without knowing that the person who would eventually unlock the box and go to the hive would be her granddaughter, standing in August of 1889 with propolis-stained gloves and a veil she had borrowed from the shed. She thought about the chain of it. The woman who had placed the brooch in the hive in 1812, Mrs. Clement's mother, who had kept the hive and called it a remembrance hive without knowing exactly what it was remembering. Mrs. Clement herself, who had passed the phrase on to Ruth Asher when the farm changed hands. Ruth Asher, who had kept the hive for 40 years and thought about what it contained without ever disturbing it. And now Clara, the last in a line of women who had been trusted with a keeping that had originated in grief. She did not yet know what to do with it, but she knew she needed to understand it properly before she decided anything. She needed to sit with it for a while, the way she had sat with her grief for her grandmother, not rushing it toward resolution, not trying to make it into something manageable before it was ready to be managed, simply giving it the time and space that the thing itself required. She went back downstairs. The brooch was on the kitchen table, where she had left it. Clean now, the tarnish still present but the propolis gone, the silver and the dark blue stone and the engraved initials all visible in the late afternoon light. She sat down at the table and looked at it. E.M. Eleanor Margaret, dead at 23 in 1811. The last person her mother had intended to wear this. She thought about the mother, the woman who had written the letter, who had been left with a brooch that had no one to go to and had found the most patient keeping she knew, who had not buried it with her daughter, not sold it, not given it away, who had chosen instead this particular form of preservation, this particular trust. She had written, "I cannot think of a better keeping than theirs." And she had been right. The bees had kept it for 77 years, through winter after winter, through the deaths of queens and the arrival of new ones, through the change of hands of the farm and the change of hands of the farm again, through Ruth Asher's 40 years of careful stewardship, and now into Clara's unknowing hands on an August afternoon, the brooch arriving at precisely the moment when the combination of circumstances, the death of a grandmother, an inheritance, a particular curiosity about a particular gap in a particular hive, had finally conspired to bring it back to the light. Clara put the kettle on, made her tea, sat with it and with the brooch in the quieting afternoon, the kitchen filling with the particular amber light of a summer day turning toward evening, the sounds of the farm settling into its evening register, the birds beginning, the bees diminishing as they always diminished toward dusk, the whole place easing into the quieter rhythms of the later hours. She thought, she needs to tell Silas Pound. Not everything, or perhaps everything, depending on what seemed right, when she sat across from him and actually began. But she had told him she would tell him when she knew the whole of it, and she now knew enough to begin. He had known the Clements. His father had known the Clements. He might know something further, might have been told something his father had been told, some fragment of the story that had survived in the way fragments survived in rural communities, passed along without knowing precisely what was being passed along or why it mattered. She would go tomorrow. Today she needed to be here, in this kitchen, with the brooch on the table and the afternoon turning and the bees completing their last flights of the day in the field beyond the garden. She needed to be still with what she had found before she did anything further with it. She looked at the brooch for a long time, at the border of small leaves and flowers that someone had worked carefully into the silver, at the dark blue stone in its intact setting, at the two small letters on the back, E.M., engraved by a silversmith who could not have known that the initials he was engraving would one day need to be read through a coat of propolis by a woman whose connection to the original owner was nothing more than the accident of having inherited the farm where the brooch had been kept. She thought, Eleanor Margaret Vane. She said the name aloud, quietly, in the kitchen, with the amber afternoon light on the old scrub table and the brooch on the cloth before her. It was not the same as telling the bees, not the formal act, not the 3 small knocks, not the deliberate words of the telling, but it was something. It was the name said in a room where it had not been said for a very long time, perhaps ever said by someone who now knew it, who had been trusted with the knowing of it by a chain of women who had kept what they were given without always understanding why. The kitchen was quiet after she said it. The evening coming on outside, the light going slowly in the way of August evenings, the summer not ready to give up its warmth, even as the day moved toward its end. She made herself a simple supper at the table, ate it beside the brooch. The two of them in the kitchen together, the woman who had been left the farm and the brooch that had been left inside the farm's oldest hive, both of them arriving at this table by routes neither could have anticipated. After she had eaten, she sat for a while without doing anything in particular. The brooch in the center of the table, the cloth beneath it, the evening light doing what August evening light did, deepening, warming, taking its time. She thought about her grandmother, about what Ruth Asher had known and what she had chosen to leave alone, about the particular quality of her grandmother's relationship to things that could not be fixed or resolved, the quality Clara had observed across 30 years of summers at Chalcombe, the quality of a woman who did not require every unanswered question to be answered, who understood that some things were simply what they were and that the appropriate response to them was continued attendance rather than resolution. She thought, my grandmother knew there was something in the 6th hive. She chose not to retrieve it, and she was right not to. Clara saw this now. Her grandmother had not known what she now knew, had not had the key, or had not known which drawer to look in for it, or had known and had decided that the key was not hers to use, had kept the brooch in its keeping because the keeping was itself a form of honouring, and had passed that honouring forward to whoever came next. Whoever came next was Clara. She picked the brooch up and held it. The metal cool now without the hive's warmth, the silver smooth where it was not engraved, the setting of the blue stone secure and complete. A small thing, a simple thing, and yet not a simple thing at all, a thing that carried, in its small oval silver body, the grief of a mother for a daughter, and the trust of that grief in the bees, and the patience of the bees across 77 years, and the careful ignorance of 3 women who had kept the hive without needing to know why. She set it back on the cloth. She went to bed before full dark, leaving the brooch on the kitchen table where she could see it when she came down in the morning, not putting it in the box, not returning it to the hive, simply leaving it in the last of the August light on the cloth on the table where her grandmother had made her daily tea and eaten her daily meals and sat in the evenings for 60 years. The brooch in the kitchen, visible and attended. The hive in the field, its work continuing without it now, the colony settling into its nightly quiet, the reduced buzz of the evening colony, exactly what it always was at this hour on a summer night at Chalcombe. She lay in the spare room bed and listened to the sounds of the farm going quiet. The last birds, the distant stream, the particular deep settling of the night around a house that had been inhabited for a very long time and knew how to be inhabited. She thought about Eleanor Margaret Vane, about being 23 years old in 1811 and not knowing that you were going to die of a fever in the spring, about the ordinary days before the fever, the ordinary mornings at Chalcombe, the kitchen garden, the apple trees in blossom, the bees beginning their season's work, the ordinary life of a young woman on a farm who could not have known that the most enduring record of her existence would be 2 small letters engraved on the back of a silver brooch, preserved in a beehive, discovered 77 years after her death by a granddaughter from London who had never heard her name. She thought, "I know your name now." She thought this without drama and without particular ceremony, simply as the straightforward statement of a fact that had not been true this morning and was true now. The August night warm around the farmhouse, the bees quiet in the field, not silent, the colony never entirely silent even in its deepest night rest, but quieter than the day, the hum of them reduced to something more like a presence than a sound, something felt rather than heard if you were still enough to feel it. Clara was still enough. She lay in the iron bed with the patchwork quilt and the August darkness at the window and the farm settling around her, and she was, for the first time since she had arrived, simply in the place. She was not arriving at it, not assessing it, not holding herself at the slight, careful distance of someone who has not yet decided how much of a thing to allow. Simply here, at Chalcombe, where the bees had kept their patient vigil through every night of the 60 years her grandmother had tended them, and through the nights before that, back and back, through the Clement women, and back further still, to the woman who had placed a small brooch in the base of the 6th hive in 1812, and written a letter to no one, and trusted the bees with what she could not otherwise carry. The night deepened around the farmhouse. The stars over the Wiltshire fields doing what stars over Wiltshire fields had always done, turning slowly, indifferent, entirely present. The bees in their hive, the brooch on the kitchen table, the letter in the box in the chest of drawers upstairs, the farm holding all of it as it had held everything given to it across the long span of its keeping. Clara fell asleep slowly, into the deep particular sleep of someone who has been in the presence of something larger than themselves and has not been diminished by it, only quieted, only stilled. She woke to the bees, as she had woken the previous morning, and the morning before that, the sound of them already present when she surfaced from sleep, the colony's dawn activity reaching her through the open window as a quality in the August air before it resolved itself into a specific sound. She lay for a moment simply receiving it. The familiar weight of the summer morning, the birds beginning in the hedgerow, the particular softness of the light through the spare room curtains, the eastern light of early morning not yet strong enough to warm the room. She thought, lying in the iron bed with the patchwork quilt, this is the third morning. The third morning she had woken at Chalcombe since her arrival on the 19th. Each morning different from the last, the first morning, the morning of arrival, of settling, of the first walk to the Hives and Silas Pound's visit and everything that had come from it. The second morning, the morning of the 6th hive and the box and the letter and the brooch on the kitchen table. And this morning, the morning after, she lay for a while longer than she had on the previous mornings. Not because she was tired, not because there was nothing to get up for, but because the particular quality of this morning seemed to require it, the particular quality of a morning that followed a day of significant discovery, the morning in which the discovery settled from event into fact, from something that had happened to something that simply was. The brooch was on the kitchen table. Eleanor Margaret Vane had died in 1811. The letter was in the box in the chest of drawers. These things were true this morning as they had been true last night, and would continue to be true regardless of what she decided to do about them. She got up. The kitchen in the early morning was the kitchen it had always been. The range, the long table, the dresser, the south window showing the field and the hive row beyond the garden wall, and on the cloth on the table, the brooch, the silver of it catching the first light through the east-facing hall window, the dark blue stone at its centre absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. She stood over it for a moment before she put the kettle on, looking at it in the morning light. It was smaller than she had been thinking of it during the night, smaller and simpler and more ordinary in the way that things examined in the particular clarity of morning always were. Not diminished, simply what it was, a small, oval silver brooch with a dark blue stone made by a silversmith in the early 19th century, worn by a young woman who had died at 23, kept by the bees for 77 years. She put the kettle on, made her tea, sat at the table and looked at the brooch beside her cup and thought about what she was going to do. The question had presented itself clearly enough in the letter. Keep it if you wish. Return it to the hive if you prefer. Two options offered without preference, left to whoever you are, whose hands this has reached. She had been turning this over since the previous afternoon, had turned it over through the evening and into the night, had not arrived at a clear answer before sleep, and now, in the morning, with the brooch in front of her and the tea in her hands, she was not sure the question was quite as simple as the letter's two options suggested. Keep it. She thought about what this meant, not simply taking the brooch upstairs and putting it in her bag and carrying it back to London. Something more considered. If she kept it, she was accepting a responsibility that came with the keeping the responsibility of knowing what it was and what it represented, of not allowing the story of Eleanor Margaret Vane to be reduced to the status of an interesting old brooch found in a beehive. Return it to the hive. She thought about this too. The act of replacing the brooch in the gap of the 6th hive, sliding the bottom board out again, placing it back, easing the board into place. The bees resealing it over time, the propolis accumulating again, the brooch disappearing back into the hive's keeping as though she had never retrieved it. But she had retrieved it. She had read the letter. She knew the name now. She had said the name aloud in this kitchen. Returning the brooch to the hive would not return it to the state of unknowing it had existed in before, would not make Eleanor Margaret Vane unknown again. She thought, there is a third option the letter does not name. She sat with this, drank her tea, the morning light moving across the kitchen floor without urgency. The third option had something to do with Silas Pound. She was not yet sure exactly what, but she thought that going to see him this morning would help her understand what the third option was, or whether it existed at all. She finished her tea, put the brooch in the pocket of her grandmother's coat, and went out. Silas Pound was in the yard when she arrived. As though he inhabited the yard in the way the bees inhabited the hive, simply always there, engaged in the work of the place, turning from it when she came with the same unhurried acknowledgement as before. She told him the letter and the box and the key, and Eleanor Margaret Vane dead at 23 in 1811. She told him the mother's decision, the brooch placed in the hive, the letter addressed to no one. She told him what her grandmother had written in the notebook and what the chain of keeping had looked like from the beginning of it to this morning. He listened without interrupting. When she had finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Vane. He said he knew that name, not personally, not anyone living, but from the particular accumulated local knowledge of a man who had farmed the same land for 50 years and paid attention to the history of the place he farmed. He said there had been a Vane family in the parish for a considerable time. He said he thought there was a gravestone in the churchyard at Eddington. He was not certain, but he thought. She said, a gravestone. He said she should go and look, that the church was a 20-minute walk from Chalcombe, and that the churchyard was small enough that she would not spend long finding whatever was there to find. He said one further thing before she left. He said, and the brooch itself, what are you going to do with it? She put her hand in the pocket of her grandmother's coat, felt the small oval weight of it against her fingers. She said, I'm not sure yet. He nodded, said that was the right answer for now. The walk to Eddington churchyard took her across the lower field and along the track that ran beside the hedgerow toward the village. August morning around her, the warmth of a morning well advanced, the sun now high enough to have taken the dew from the grass, the hedgerow full of the sounds of late summer, the blackbirds, the insects beginning in the cow parsley and the bramble that overhung the track. She had always liked walking, had walked as a child across this same landscape in the summers at Chalcombe, when her grandmother had sent her out after breakfast with the instruction that she should come back before lunch and that the countryside was large enough to absorb any amount of walking without requiring any particular destination. She had learned, in those summers, the particular pleasure of walking without needing to arrive anywhere, of attending to what the landscape offered as you passed. She had not walked like that in London. Walking in London was always walking somewhere. Not this, not the walking that was simply being in a place that was worth being in. The churchyard at Eddington was indeed small. The church itself, old Norman in parts, the tower, the particular squat shape of Norman towers in this part of Wiltshire, the whole building settled into the landscape as though it had grown there. The churchyard around it bounded by a low stone wall, the grass within it cut but not formally maintained, the older sections toward the north and east, where the older families were buried growing up between the stones. She went to the older section, walked slowly through it. Reading the stones she could read, many of them weathered to illegibility, the lettering worn flat by the decades of rain and frost. She moved among them without hurry, reading what she could and passing what she could not. She found it in the north corner, a stone of medium size, the limestone darker than most of the others, sheltered from the bleaching of direct sunlight by the yew tree that grew a few feet from it. The lettering was still clear. She crouched in front of it and read, Eleanor Margaret Vane, beloved daughter, 1788 to 1811. She read it twice, sat back on her heels in the long grass and looked at the stone. The dates, 1788 to 1811, 23 years old, exactly as the letter had said, the beloved daughter of a woman who had placed a brooch in a beehive the following year and trusted the keeping of it to bees. Beloved daughter. The stone said nothing else, simply the name and the dates and those two words. Clara put her hand in her coat pocket, closed her fingers around the brooch, the metal warming now against her palm. She stayed in the churchyard for a while, simply sitting on her heels in the long grass beside the stone, in the shade of the yew in the August morning. The brooch in her palm, the stone in front of her. She thought about the third option, not keeping the brooch in London, not returning it to the hive, but keeping it at Chalcombe, here on this farm, in the place where it had been kept since 1812, in the landscape that contained Eleanor Margaret Vane's grave and the church she had presumably attended and the fields her family had farmed, not separated from its origins, simply brought into the house rather than the hive, kept at Chalcombe by whoever kept Chalcombe. She stood, brushed the grass from her skirt, looked at the stone one last time. She said the name once, quietly, in the morning air of the churchyard. Then she walked back to Chalcombe. She spent the afternoon in the sitting room with the diaries. She took the oldest from the shelf first, not the most recent, not the year of her grandmother's death, but the oldest, the first year of the 37. The first entry was brief. Her grandmother's handwriting, younger looking than Clara, remembered it, the script less settled, the letters still finding the form they would eventually establish for themselves across the following decades. A simple record of the first day, the weather, the condition of the kitchen garden, what needed doing, and at the end, a single sentence. Went to see the bees this evening. 6 hives, all strong. The 6th the oldest and the quietest and the most settled. I do not know yet what is in it, but I will not disturb it. Whatever it holds, it has earned the right to hold it. Clara sat with the diary open in her lap for a long time. The afternoon light on the open page. Her grandmother's handwriting, younger and less settled than she had known it, writing those words on an autumn evening 60 years ago, the 6th hive new to her, and the keeping already established before she had arrived. Whatever it holds, it has earned the right to hold it. She turned the page and read on. She read for several hours, not the whole of the 37 diaries, but the first and the second, and then the most recent, the entries of the months before her grandmother's death. The quiet December, the cold January, and the bees in their winter cluster, the early spring and the first flights of the year, the summer building again. Her grandmother's voice in the entries, unmistakable, the same quality she had known across 30 summers at Chalcombe. The particular combination of practicality and quiet attention that had always characterized Ruth Asher. The weather, the garden, the bees, the small incidents of a life lived quietly on a Wiltshire farm and attended to with the patient interest of someone who found the ordinary details of daily life genuinely worth noting. And running through all of it, the bees, always the bees. The sixth hive mentioned regularly across every year, its strength, its autumn stores, the particular settled quality, something about that colony that the others don't have, present in every year, as it had been present in every year before her grandmother arrived. Back to the woman who had placed the brooch in it in 1812. Clara set the last diary down as the afternoon light began to deepen. Went to the kitchen, the brooch still on the cloth on the table. She picked it up, carried it to the south window. She thought, Eleanor Margaret Vane, beloved daughter, 1788 to 1811, and then she did what she had decided, sometime during the afternoon, that she was going to do. She went to the study, found a sheet of paper and her grandmother's pen, sat down and wrote not a long letter, but longer than the small card, with the name and the date. She wrote what she knew, the name, the dates, the letter, the keeping. She wrote that the brooch had been retrieved in August 1889 by Clara Asher, granddaughter of Ruth Asher, who had kept the farm since 1849. She wrote that the brooch was being kept at Chalcombe and not returned to the hive, and that, if it was found again by someone who came after, this note was to explain its presence and its history. She folded the note, went upstairs and took the box from the chest of drawers and opened it. She placed the brooch on the faded blue silk. In the impression left by its early arresting, the brooch settling back into it with the particular rightness of something returned to its proper place. She placed her folded note beside the original letter. She placed the small card with the name and the date where it had been. She closed the box, locked it, replaced it under the folded lace in the back of the top drawer exactly as she had found it. She stood in her grandmother's bedroom for a moment. The north-facing window, the cool, even light, the bed made, the room entirely itself. A room that had been one person's room for 60 years and was now, by inheritance, hers, though it did not yet feel like hers, and she was not sure when or whether it would, and was beginning to suspect that was all right. She walked to the hives in the early evening, the sixth visit to the hive row in 3 days. The first 2 evenings simply standing, looking. The third morning the careful examination in the daylight. The fourth the retrieval, the smoker, the bottom board eased forward. Yesterday evening spent indoors with the letter and the brooch. And now this, the evening walk to the hives, with nothing in her hands and nothing to do when she arrived except stand in the August evening and be there. The light at this hour was the light she had come to think of as the farm's own light. The late afternoon gold of it, the particular angle that made the hawthorn hedge cast its long shadow across the hive row and turned the pale painted wood of the first 5 hives amber, and made the dark weathered wood of the 6th simply darker, more itself. The bees in their evening diminishment, not the full summer activity of midday, the colony pulling inward as the light went, the foragers returning and not setting out again, the entrance quieter than it had been all day. She stood a few feet from the 6th hive and listened to the change in the sound of it. Lower, slower, but not silent. Never silent while there was any warmth left in the August air. She stood there for a long time, not doing anything, not thinking anything in particular, simply standing in the field beside her grandmother's hives in the late August evening, the brooch in the box in the bedroom, the letter folded beside it, the name known now and written down and placed alongside the original account of the keeping. She thought about what she was going to do with the farm. Not the question of what to do about the brooch, that question had answered itself in the afternoon. But the larger question, the one the solicitor's letter had named, and that she had been carrying alongside everything else since July. She did not have an answer yet. She knew this. She had 3 days at Chalcombe, not 3 months, not enough time to know, not enough time to understand what the farm asked of whoever kept it. She had looked at the hives. She had held the smoker. She had read 2 of the 37 diaries. But she was beginning to think that the question was not whether she was ready. Her grandmother had not been ready when she came to Chalcombe. The photograph on the dresser had shown a young woman standing in a bare field with her hands in her pockets and the look of someone who had made a decision and not yet begun to enact it. 40 years later, the diaries showed what the decision had produced. But at the beginning, simply the decision. Clara looked at the 6th hive, the bottom board back in place, the colony unchanged, the same colony, the same 30,000 bees, going about the same work as yesterday, as last week, as last year, and the year before. The 6th hive continuing exactly as it had always continued, with or without the brooch in its base, the keeping simply shifting from the physical object to the knowledge of what the object had been and where it now rested. She thought, my grandmother kept this farm for 60 years. She thought, her predecessor kept it before that, and before that, back to the woman who came to the farm as a bride in the early 1800s and called the 6th hive the Remembrance Hive and passed it forward. She thought, they did not know what they were inheriting until they arrived. None of them had known. They had simply come and looked and stayed. The evening deepening around the farm, the swallows beginning their circuits above the field, the bees completing their last flights of the day, each one finding the entrance of its own hive with the precision of a creature that had been doing this since the spring and had long since stopped needing to think about it. She would go back to London. Not tomorrow. She had the farm for another 4 days. She would spend them the way she had spent these first 3, looking, walking, reading her grandmother's diaries, sitting with the hives in the mornings and the evenings, learning the particular rhythms of the place in the only way a place could be learned, which was simply by being in it over time. And then she would go back to London, and she would think about what she wanted, not what was practical, not what made sense from the outside, but what she actually wanted, in the deep, quiet way that things were actually wanted when you had given yourself enough time and enough stillness to hear it. She thought she already knew, but she was not going to say it to herself yet. Not standing in the field on the 3rd evening. Some things needed the full length of time they actually required. She turned back toward the house, walked the familiar path along the edge of the kitchen garden, the path she had walked 3 times now, each time a little more familiar, the particular compression of the grass where she walked already beginning to show the faint trace of repeated passage. Not a path yet, but the beginning of one. The kitchen in the evening, the range, the long table, the dresser, the south window showing the field going dark outside. She made her supper and ate it at the table, and sat afterward in the way she had sat the previous evenings, not idle, but present, not thinking but attending. The kitchen smelled of lavender. She noticed it again, as she had noticed it on the first evening, the dried lavender in the beams, the accumulated scent of many summers of her grandmother hanging bundles from the same hooks. And beneath the lavender, the other smells, old stone, warm wood, the particular smell of a kitchen that had been used for 60 years by the same person for the same purposes. She thought about whether the smell would outlast the summer, whether the dried lavender, without her grandmother to replace it, would gradually lose its strength through the autumn and winter and spring, becoming fainter with each month until it was simply part of the general smell of the house. She thought it would. She thought that was how these things worked, the specific presences people left behind, diminishing by degrees, not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily and gently, until what remained was simply the place itself. She thought, unless someone cuts new lavender next June and hangs it in the beams. She sat with this for a moment, the thought arriving with a particular quietness, not urgently, simply present, like the smell of lavender itself, mild, warm, entirely itself. She went to bed. In the spare room with the iron bed and the patchwork quilt and the back window open to the night air. The sounds of the farm in its evening quiet, the last birds, the distant stream, the particular quiet of the hive row that was not actually silence but the colony's night register, the deep, slow breath of 30,000 sleeping bees. She lay for a while without sleeping, not restlessly, simply still, the August night, around the farmhouse, doing what August nights in Wiltshire did, warm and full and entirely itself. She thought about the brooch in the box, in the chest of drawers, the silk lining with the impression of the oval shape, now occupied again, the letter beside it, and her own note beside the letter, the small card with the name and the date, the box locked with the small key put back in the kitchen drawer where she had found it. She thought about Eleanor Margaret Vane in the churchyard under the yew tree, beloved daughter, 1788 to 1811, 23 years old, known now to Clara Asher, who had come to Chalcombe in August 1889 to begin understanding what she had inherited. She thought about her grandmother's handwriting in the oldest diary. Whatever it holds, it has earned the right to hold it. She thought, and now the house holds it instead. The farm holds it, as the farm had held everything given to it across the long years of its keeping the grief of the woman in 1812, the faithful ignorance of the Clement women, the quiet attention of Ruth Asher, across 60 years of daily entries in 37 diaries. All of it held here, in the stone of the farmhouse and the kitchen dresser and the dried lavender in the beams and the 6th hive under the hawthorn hedge. The bees outside continuing their patient work, not stopped by the dark. The colony holding its warmth through the August night, the queen at the center of it, the 30,000 bees arranged in the particular ancient order of their kind, patient and purposeful and entirely themselves. Clara fell asleep, into the particular deep sleep of someone who has been in the right place and has understood, quietly and without drama, that it is the right place. Only quieted, only stilled. The August night continued around the farmhouse, the stars over Wiltshire, the distant stream, the brooch in the box, the letter folded beside it, the 6th hive with its bottom board back in place, and the colony settled into its long, warm night. The farm holding all of it, as it had always held what was given to it, with the patience of old stone and old wood and the patient particular bees, with no urgency and no condition, simply holding, simply continuing, as farms and bees and the things kept within them had always continued. Sleep well.